I wanted to share a story about how to disagree well. It's a lesson I learned really early on in life and that I continue to learn over the years. When I grew up, most of my extended family lived in Texas. I lived in Canada with my family, with my immediate family, but most of my extended family was in Texas. And I grew up spending summers and Christmases and holidays at my grandparents' house in Dallas. And when I think about where is home, as I grew up, I always think about their house in Texas. Now, from my grandmother, I learned a deep love of cooking and of gathering, of putting people around the table to share a meal and be together. And from my grandfather, I learned some lessons that have impacted and influenced my whole life, and in particular, my career. Now, my grandfather was an oil executive with an oil company. He was a petroleum engineer. He was a product of his generation. So he believed that in fiscal conservatism, he was a Republican. But the Republican Party, as it was in the days well before Trump, and so he believed in, being principled, in pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, in being responsible and being kind to others. He believed in taking care of business. He was also a fundraiser for the party in Texas. So he was really committed to both the principles of the party, but also the actions it took to make the party successful. Now, as a young woman, I had some fairly left leaning ideas about how the world should work, about what I valued and what I believed in. Um, my grandfather and I almost never agreed, but we talked and talked and talked. He called me the panko of the family, which is the 1950s term for communist. So you can see where the conversation would often take us. But he always said it in a very loving way. I learned from my grandfather that you can be in a loving relationship and fundamentally and totally disagree with each other. Now, he was a master of self discipline and self awareness. So sometimes when the conversation would get heated, he'd sit back in his lazy boy and he'd pull out his pipe and he'd start to fill it really slowly. Nobody smokes a pipe anymore. He'd start to fill it really slowly. And he'd say, "It seems that things are getting a little hot under the collar here." And he'd sort of just stop talking. He'd stop participating in the conversation until he'd fully filled the bowl of his pipe and until he'd put it in his mouth and taken a couple of puffs and then he'd re-engage. We would go back to the discussion, and that pause would always allow us both to kind of settle a little bit. It would allow us to remember that we're in this relationship where we love each other. And actually, half the fun of being in this relationship is disagreeing with each other, but doing it in a kind and loving way, just exploring the way that we see the world with such different eyes. I don't always get it right in my personal life or in my work. It's a thing I think you have to learn over and over again. But these conversations grounded in mutual respect, where we are courageous enough to say what we think and compassionate enough to be open and listen well to others, are the kinds of conversations that allow us to not be focused on, are we on the same page? Do we think alike? But instead, how do we value each other's perspectives and experiences and still move forward together? I think you can fundamentally disagree and still be in a loving relationship. Thanks for listening.